Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, March 31st, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. Hello to everybody.
Let's get started, Colonel, with what has happened yesterday. We've learned that from the mainstream media, MSNBC reported, as their reporter talked with Donald Trump, he said two things about Russia and Iran. First, he wants to put secondary sanctions, tariffs, as he calls, on Iran and Russia because he's not happy with the leadership in Russia and Iran. And on the other hand, he wants to bomb Iran. And on the part of the Iranians, we've learned that they're going to be able to attack. It seems that the United States is going to use Diego Garcia base, and Iranians and our notion was that Iran was not capable of attacking Diego Garcia, but what Iranian sources are talking about, they're capable of attacking Diego Garcia, which it seems that there is no air defense system in that base. How do you find the way that Donald Trump is dealing with Iran right now?
Well, in fact, the question applies also to the way United States deals with Russia, because what you see, in fact, is a very chaotic approach to the problems. We understand, and I've explained several times, that obviously Trump wants to get rid of the conflicts that are considered as a liability that he inherited from the Biden administration. And therefore, he wants to get rid of that. And that's especially true for Ukraine and probably a little bit for the Middle East, although the Middle East, he was probably less involved directly. And the problem is that we understand the idea, but I'm not sure that the Biden administration, including the Biden team, I would say, understood the very nature of the problems. And that's very obvious with Ukraine, that the special envoy, who used to be Keith Kellogg, has been replaced by Steve Witkoff, because obviously Keith Kellogg didn't had the right understanding of the problem. It's not, and hence, of course, of the possible responses or solutions. Because, as I always said, from the way you understand the problem comes the way you solve it. And if you don't understand it, there's no way you can solve it. And that's exactly the problem Trump has. By the way, he is not the only one. At least he would like to solve the problem. But you have an equally misunderstanding from the European side, for instance, for all the conflict. They don't understand the conflicts. And therefore, but they are not able to provide a response. The difference between Trump and Europe is that Trump tries to provide a response while the Europeans don't even try. They are out of the game from the very beginning. So therefore, you don't even notice that they don't understand anything. The problem is that on the side of the US, they would like to solve the problem, but they don't understand its complexity. And we have seen that with the various attempts to have a ceasefire and to link that with the Black Sea Initiative and all that. But they understood that the problem is deeper, requires more attention, cannot be solved in 2 or 3 meetings, and that the view of the Ukrainians and the Israelis needs the Russians need to be harmonized, and they don't know how to address that. And we have exactly the same thing with Iran. Incidentally, we had this interview with CBS or I think it was
MSNBC, if I'm not mistaken.
MSNBC. Okay, anyway. But last week we had the audition of Tulsi Gabbard, who presented the threat assessment, the DNI threat assessment for 2025. And she explicitly said what I think I have said on your channel, She used exactly the same word, that in fact Iran has stopped its nuclear program in 2003. Now, here you can see the contradiction, the discrepancy. On the one hand, you have the DNI, and obviously she Tulsi Gabbard was specially selected by Donald Trump, meaning that we can expect them to be on the same line. And she says that Iran basically is not a nuclear threat. And on the other hand, you have Trump wanting to attack Iran. So why? I don't see exactly the rationale behind all this. We'll see. If the problem is that they consider the Houthis as a proxy of Iran, then why don't they talk to Iran? Problem is, of course, that the Houthis are not a proxy of Iran. That's where, and we have exactly the same problem today for the Ukrainian conflict as we have for the Middle East conflict. And when I say Middle East, it's obviously what's happening in Palestine, but also what regards the relationship between the US and Iran. Everything is based on a narrative. And the narrative comes from the same source, basically. And it comes from Israel. And they promoted this narrative that Iran wanted to destroy Israel, they have proxies and all that. But if you analyze properly things, you will see that the Houthis, and especially their initiative to declare an embargo or blockade, you can find the name you want here, against Israel, is a policy that was decided in Yemen itself. It's not an Iranian policy. It's a Houthis or Ansar Allah policy. And we probably and surely some weaponry of the Houthis come from Iran. But does it mean that Iran can decide for the Houthis or impose a decision on the Houthis? You know, Ukraine receives a lot of weapons from the US. But even though the Ukrainians do things that the US don't want. I mean, the attack on Kursk, the attack on the Kerch Bridge, and all that. And that was, by the way, that appeared in the New York Times or Washington Post, Washington Post, I think, just a couple of days ago, that a lot of things that the Ukrainians do is in fact not against the will of the US. Although the US are the biggest provider of weapon, intelligence, and all that to Ukraine. So on the one hand, we see that, and by the way, Marco Rubio said that the Ukrainian war is a proxy war. So meaning that you see on the one hand, we have a proxy war where the Ukrainians do whatever they want, even if they don't, without the approval of the US. And on the other hand, we assume that the Houthis are the proxies of Iran, and we expect Iran or the Houthis to do exactly what Iranians say, but we don't want to discuss to the Iranians. So we see that we have a totally paradoxical approach to these conflicts. And we cannot accept the logic of one conflict that may apply to another one. And therefore, here I see kind of a chaotic approach to the situation. If we agree that, okay, Trump wants to stop these conflicts because he wants to focus on other issues, and the main issues was mandated for is in fact to improve U.S. economy, which, by the way, is not going well. Uh, I can agree that that's fine if it wants to settle these conflicts or impose even peace on this conflict. Why not? The whole thing is that we see it's very hard to understand exactly what is driving the U.S. policy here, because on Ukraine, obviously there's some attempt to have negotiations and all that, but we don't see that on the Middle Eastern scene. And we have a very strong rhetoric. And I think the difference here is that Trump believes in the balance of force and the this kind of relationship between countries, and he understands that Russia is a strong opponent, and therefore they needs to be polite. He needs to be polite with them. But he still considered the Iranians are weak or not a kind of a negligible force, and therefore it tries to impose its will, which is not completely. Again, we have here in the in strategic inconsistency. There is an operational consistency, because we see that, as I have said, I think on your channel already, Trump is applying the so-called gunboat policy. That's what he has done in Panama. That's what he tries to do with Greenland, where he said that he may not use force to achieve his goal to have Greenland. And now he's trying to do the same with Iran. He said, well, if you don't do what I want you to do, then I will start to bomb you. So this is the gunboat policy. And we expected, I expected, given what Trump said in January as regard to the Ukraine conflict, that, and also what senator is no longer senator, Marco Rubio said, I expected the Trump administration being the occasion of a comeback of diplomacy on the international scene. But I'm not sure it's exactly that. We still have this kind of, it's not diplomacy, it's, as I said, gunboat policy, meaning that you impose by force what you want. And that's, I think that's exactly what disturbs most countries, and especially countries like Iran, which has a very mature diplomacy and has extremely positive and let's say constructive relationship with other countries such as China, Russia, and even Saudi Arabia. Meaning that you have, on the one hand, a country where diplomacy has been not only celebrated, but also used extensively, because it's a country that doesn't want to use force unless it is constrained to, as it had to do last year on 2 occasions with Israel. But on the Western side, and I include Israel in that, because Israel is not a Middle Eastern country. Israel is a European country in the Middle East. With a European mindset, it has the same arrogance as the Europeans. It is ethnically European. It has nothing to do with this region, not from last year, not from 1948 and 2000 years ago. Israel has nothing to do with the Middle East, the Israel we know today, and it has exactly the same mindset. And this mindset is driven by arrogance, and this is exactly what we see with the U.S. this is a little bit, and I say that because I come from a country which is very small, but which is also very arrogant. We have the arrogance of those who have been successful. When you are successful, and that's very true with my country, Switzerland. Uh, Besides all all the problem it has, it's a country which is essentially successful. We tend to be arrogant because we think that we have the ultimate recipe for success. That's exactly, in that sense, fortunately, Switzerland is not that big, but we have exactly the same arrogance as the Americans because they have the feeling that they have the recipe for success. They are democratic, or supposed to, and they are successful economically. They have a strong military and all that, and that gives them the right, with quotation mark, to impose their solution because they have the ultimate solution for problems. And it's interesting to see, by the way, I just quoted this article from the Washington Post or New York Times on the secret war or secret implication of the US in the Ukraine conflict. But and in this article, it was said that the Americans were surprised that the Ukrainians didn't accept all the advice of the Americans because they think we have a good advice, so they should accept it. And I think that reflects exactly the way Americans and Europeans at large, Western countries at large, address the rest of the world, because they feel they have democracy, because they feel they have a very high standard of living, because they feel they ruled the world for several centuries. Then they are entitled to decide for others what they have to do. And I think that's a little bit what we have. And as long as we keep to be in that mentality, we'll avoid the necessity of addressing other countries as equal. And that's very true with Iran. If you look at the fundamentals, and I have several friends who are Iranians, but if you look at the fundamentals, you will see Iranians is essentially probably the most Western oriented country in the Middle East. It's a country where the population is extremely positive toward the West. And what antagonizes Iran to us is, in fact, because we have a threatening behavior. We threatened them since 1979. The Americans never swallowed the change of regime, the toppling of the Shah, and the new government with with Khomeini, and above all, they never swallowed the problem with the personnel of the U.S. embassy in Tehran. That remains here, and therefore, since then it's very difficult to have someone reasonable in the U.S. that has the willingness to open a dialogue with the Iranians, and that's a pity, because the Iranians could be the best ally of the world, of the Western world in the Middle East, and a factor of stability as well. Geographically, you see that it has a key position in the Middle East. It has now very good relationship with the second big player in the Middle East, which is Saudi Arabia, meaning that we have all the ingredients to have stability in the Middle East. The only disturbing factor is Israel. And Israel, the problem of Israel is that it doesn't have a foreign policy. It wages war. I mean, war is its foreign policy. As I explained many times, security policy is based on two pillars: the foreign policy and your defense policy. And some countries, such as my country in Switzerland, but we are in Europe, obviously, uh, we considered that foreign policy should be the main pillar of the security policy. And therefore, we developed the concept of security through cooperation, which reflects essentially that. Although we had during the Cold War, now it's not exactly the same, but during the Cold War, Switzerland had one of the largest armies in the Europe. We have to see that, even if it's a tiny country. Israel, on the other hand, doesn't understand its security policy that way. It assumes that its geopolitical environment just want to reject Israel. And this is the kind of black or white understanding of the Middle East mindset, which is totally wrong. But again, I repeat, all the leadership and the majority of the population of Israel doesn't come from the Middle East. This is a population which is essentially Central European. Netanyahu coming from Poland, Smotrich or Ben-Gvir coming from Ukraine. So we have this kind of mentality that doesn't has any commonality with the Middle East. And therefore, for them, everything that doesn't think like them is enemy. And therefore, the foreign policy of Israel never managed to have or to build up good relation with its neighbors. All the peace agreements you had between Israel and its neighbors, such as with Jordan or Egypt, they were all brokered by the US. It's not the result of the Israeli foreign policy. It was the result of the US foreign policy. The policy, the security policy of Israel is based on the second pillar, which is the defense policy. And that's the reason why Israel is constantly attacking its neighbors, even endangering peace treaties it had with its neighbors, such as Jordan, and more recently with Egypt. So this is, I think, here we have a fundamental issue with Israel, because as long as Israel doesn't understand that diplomacy and foreign policy must be the centerpiece of good relation and geopolitical integration in a region, as long as they don't understand that, there is no way we will have peace in the Middle East. I mean, all the conflict we had, the conflict in Iraq, the conflict in Syria, the conflict in Lebanon, the conflict in Sudan, even in Sudan, that was influenced by Israel, because they were afraid having an Islamic country in Sudan, so they started to destabilize it. And I have been 2 years as a chief of intelligence for the UN in Sudan. I can tell you this was an issue. And even when I was talking to the my US, I mean, there were obviously US intelligence, different intelligence services operating in Sudan. But I discussed to them, we came always to the same point. So this is the problem of Israel. They always they understand themselves as threatened by everybody. And if we look at it reasonably, you would see that, in fact, nobody really cares. In fact, if Israel would behave properly, applying the international humanitarian law, abiding by international law, nobody would bother. The day Israel understands that the key for its security is to implement UN resolutions about Palestinians. And as long as the issues with Palestinians are solved, nobody will bother about Israel. Israel is bothering about others, but not the opposite. So we have here a fundamental issue, and that reflects, coming back to your question of Trump and Iran. I think here we have also a problem. Obviously, Iran is a traditional enemy of the U.S., but there is a there has been a development that Israel has also adopted Iran as their best enemy, because they understood that if they want to have a physical military implication of the US in the Middle East, the best way to have this implication is to have a problem with Iran. And that's why you have Netanyahu constantly asking or making efforts to press the US to attack Iran. Now, the situation with Iran is probably a little bit more rhetorical than factual at this stage, because something has changed radically in the past year. One is certainly the relationships between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And attacking Iran would be also a red light for a lot, or it's a warning light for a lot of countries in the Middle East, not just Iran. That's the first. But more importantly, you had two agreements signed by Iran with Russia one last year, that was a military cooperation agreement, and early this year you had a comprehensive strategic cooperation agreement that was signed with Russia, and meaning that now attacking Iran would probably have more implications on the global, let's say, geopolitical sphere than attacking Iran, let's say, 2 or 3 years ago. And that is probably something that the US must be aware of. We had, I haven't followed that in details, to be honest, but there was this incident with the Signal application involving Mike Waltz and others.
Pete Hexet, yeah,
Except
JD Vance,
exactly,
all of them.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. But what was apparent in this sequence is that you have different views within the Trump administration as to the policy towards Iran and even the Houthis, because despite the fact that the US reacted and bombed Yemen a couple of days ago, there is apparently some different views about this in the Trump administration. And you have some people saying that, and that's also the position of J.D. Vance, as long again, I might be wrong, but I think it's Vance who said that in fact we should not, the U.S. should not be involved in those conflicts, and that's something also new. I'm not Iran, as Russia, China, all these problems are in essence bipartisan in the U.S. Politics, generally speaking. Meaning it's on both sides, Republicans and Democrats who will have similar view on those countries. The difference may appear in the way to approach the problem, and that's what we may see, and therefore Trump, we have to be careful, because he reacts in a very emotional and impulsive way, but at the same time I'm not sure he acts in a exactly same impulsive way. After all, it has also to not to comply, but it has to take the advice of some others before acting into something that may have a geopolitical or geostrategical strategic implications. Therefore, what he says about you mentioned this threats about sanctions, and but he threatened the Russia in January already with sanctions, and later he said that Putin is a great guy. So you see, there is a kind of a chaotic approach here. This is, but I'm not sure it's totally irrational approach. Let's be fair with Trump. It's chaotic, but not completely irrational, meaning that he used also the rhetoric to press people to try to have some kind of leverage on individual, and that was obvious with the sanctions he promised to Russia. Now, these sanctions and all these threats, I'm not sure even he believes in them, because we know that they are totally ineffective. I'm not sure Trump himself believes that they are ineffective, but a lot of people around him understand that they are ineffective. So I wouldn't be so, let's say, I would see what you addressed, or what you had in your question. I mean, this rhetoric towards Iran and Russia, I would see that with caution, but not with anxiety. That's probably the way I would see it.
Colonel, you've mentioned the way that the United States, we have a sort of concept in the economy, it says ad hoc economy, and you see what would happen, then you're going to deal with the problem. It seems that the Trump administration is totally the opposite. They're trying to make a problem for these countries, and in order to have some sort of reaction from Russia and Iran, and they're going to deal with it. But as you've mentioned, there are similarities in the way that Russia and Iran would behave toward the United States, would react to the United States. We've been witnessing the way that Russia is fighting in Ukraine. Russia was, as they talked, Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia went into Ukraine. But you see the attacks on the part of the West on Russia. Russia is just, if you look at the lines of the battlefield, they didn't change that much. That's why the propaganda on the part of the West, Russia is not advancing, Russia is losing. They're just they want to make a point in Ukraine. And they've been talking about the same sort of strategy since the war in Ukraine started. And right now with Iran, it seems to me the same. The United States is making everything to threaten Iran, to just, we're going to attack you, we're going to sanction you. They know the sanctions. They've been sanctioning Iran for more than 44 years. They're not afraid of sanctions. They've been fighting with the United States in Iraq. The war in Iraq, it wasn't Iraq. It was all the West together with Iraq, and Iran was fighting them. They know what's the nature of this sort of rhetoric on the part of the United States. It's somehow the difference in the way that they're thinking. The Iranian, the Eastern sort of thinking is totally different from the ones in the West. That's why they don't communicate to each other?
Well, there are different things. First of all, when we talk about sanctions, there is something that strikes me, is that I have the feeling, not only me, but I have the feeling that sanctions has become the ultimate foreign policy tool that we have in the West. As soon as someone doesn't behave as we want or doesn't accept what we want, and that applies to Hungary within the European Union. Hungary has a different view as Ursula von der Leyen, so they apply sanctions. Sanction has been a substitute for diplomacy, in fact. And that's the first strange evolution that we had in the last, I would say, 20 years. And that applies, by the way, to Switzerland also. I mean, Switzerland was known for its diplomacy, its ability to deal. And when we talk about Iran, you know that the U.S. interests in Iran were represented by the Swiss embassy, and vice versa. The Iranian interests in the U.S. were represented by the Swiss embassy in Washington. So we had this game of diplomatic relationships, and today, and the Washington Post made last year. I'm making a lot of publicity for the Washington Post today, but last year that was in August or October or so, the Washington Post published an article about sanctions and all that, and you could see on the graph they showed that the first country that applies the most sanctions in the world is the U.S., and the second largest country that applies sanctions is Switzerland. And that's extremely strange. It's totally unexpected, and it's also something that shocks the Swiss. But it's not just because Swiss is a neutral country, but because sanctions have become, as I said, a substitute for diplomacy. That's certainly an evolution that is, in fact, institutional and could be changed. And apparently, we are not going in an improvement on that direction. But there's a second aspect that you address. This is the problem of the mindset. And as I said before, in the West at large, we have the sense or sentiment or the idea that because we were successful in building up our countries, and because our countries have ruled the world to some extent for a couple of centuries, we have the feeling that we should decide for others. And we don't understand other type of mindsets. And when you see the different problems that you may have in within countries or among countries, you may have different logics that come into the game. For instance, just something that comes to my mind. When addressing the Syrian conflict, a lot of people in the European media used to say that Bashar al-Assad came from a minority, and therefore it was kind of the dictatorship of the Alawi minority on the rest of the population. And in reality, and I have seen that in many different countries, especially North African countries. In reality, when you look at the pattern of the balance of power within the country, you could see that the Alawi were in fact the smallest party, and you had much bigger tribes or ethnic groups, but I prefer the word tribe in the sense that it represents a certain power in the country. You had much bigger tribes in Syria that could, in fact, claim the power. But if you look at the process in which the Alawi came into the power, you could see that in fact it was an agreement between the different powers to have the smallest tribe to be in charge. And you have seen exactly when you talk about Gaddafi in Libya, he was also a member of the smallest tribe of Syria, of Libya, sorry. And Libya was also ruled by a council of tribes. It's not. It was not a structure as we have in the West, where you have a parliament, a council. You had representatives of the different tribes, and they selected the representative of the weakest tribe. So, and therefore, you can, of course, from a Western perspective, you could say, well, that's absurd. I mean, the majority should rule the rest. But in those countries, you have a different approach to the problem. They say, well, if we have the biggest tribes in charge, or one of the biggest tribes, then it will be challenged by the other ones, and you will end up with a war. If you give the power to the smallest one, it will be very easy for us to make pressure and to change the way the country is ruled. And therefore, it's better to have the weakest in charge and to have the largest countries to support them. And therefore, you have a commonality. The largest will be in the opposition, not opposition, but they will be part of the council. They have equal status. There will not be a rivalry between the largest tribes. They will have to work together. And it's a different type of logic. And that's exactly what happened in Syria. And today we overthrew the Alawi, and therefore now we have something which is the rule of the most powerful, which is definitely not what we want to have in this region. So this kind of thinking, this kind of approach to power, to the balance of power, to the relationship among powers, and that applies to the domestic situation, as I explained for Syria and Libya, but it may happen also in the way we address international relations. And this way of thinking is something which is totally absent from Western thinking. I explained also this idea that the idea from a military point of view now, when we talk about Hezbollah and all that, the idea of victory, for instance, this is a typical cultural thing. For us, Western countries, and that applies obviously for Israel, you achieve victory when you destroy your enemy. But for a Muslim, victory is when you don't give up fighting. It's not destroying the enemy. Victory is understood as something for oneself, not for the others. So it's a totally different perspective. And that's the reason why we never managed to have victory or to achieve victory in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Islamic countries at large, because they have a different understanding of victory. For them, resisting and the ability to resist, the willingness to resist, is already a victory. Therefore, how can you defeat an enemy like this? As I said very often, how can you threaten some, or let's say deter someone with death when this person is ready to die? You see, you're in a kind of a logical paradox, and that's exactly what we have when we address the Middle East. It's not. This is something which is definitely related to the Middle East. It cannot be applied to Russia, not even other Asian country. But when it comes to the Middle East, this is the way where we should approach the problem. And or the way we approach the problem and the way we fail in approaching the problem. And that's exactly, I said before, Israel is not a Middle Eastern country. It's a European country. I mean, it has not the mindset of the region. It has not a 2,000 years heritage. It's wrong. It has a couple of year heritage coming from Europe. And that explains why they are totally unable to cope with the Palestinian problem. And I can predict they will never achieve victory against the Palestinians, simply because they don't understand how the Palestinians understand victory, or the different understanding between they might destroy a lot of people and kill a lot of people, but they will never achieve victory because the others will claim victory. And the others, and that's also the interesting thing, is that for a Muslim or for a Palestinian, let's say, they have an objective victory from their point of view, while the Israelis have a subjective victory because killing civilians doesn't bring victory. For the Palestinians, when a civilian dies, it's sad, and it's sad for everybody. But since they died for a cause, this is part of the victory. And that, I think, that should drive our approach to the Middle East. I mean, this is obviously very simplistic. If you read my book, the book I have behind me here on the fighting or addressing the jihadi terrorism, I explain that in much more details, because obviously there are a lot of, I mean, when you go into the nitty-gritty of this, the different mindsets, that's where you can achieve victory against the terrorism. But you have to address the different perceptions of a war and the different perception of how to achieve victory. That's the only way to achieve success against terrorism. That's exactly what we haven't done. And that's exactly the reason why everything we have done in the past 30 years is just increase the number of people ready to do terrorist act and the number of terrorist actions or terrorist operation. That's exactly, you can look at the figures, you can look at statistics. We spend billions of dollars in trying to fight terrorism. We have just increased the problem, precisely because we are applying a Western understanding of warfare, and instead of addressing the problem, adjust our strategy to the enemy. And that's a very basic lesson of war. When you want to fight, you have to have a strategy that is based on what your enemy does. Not if you have a strategy that is just coming out of the blue. Well, you may have chance and that's be successful, or in most cases you have the risk is great that you will be wrong. And that's exactly what happens to us. We have created terrorism. George Bush and all the president who followed, including a Western country, European countries, François Hollande and so on, have created the terrorism. In fact, they made everything that you could imagine that would create terrorism. Objectively, I mean, this is not just a narrative here. If you would create terrorism, you would do exactly what they have done, because they have done exactly the opposite of the what is required to address terrorism at large. And we are no longer in I mean the Islamic State and all that is probably not completely, but to the large extent.
Colin, it's even worse. We have terrorists running Syria right
Yes,
now.
well, we could say that, but we
How
could say that. But again, we have to be careful here. Yes, I agree with that. And Tahrir al-Sham was listed as terrorist organization, including al-Jalani and all that. That's clear. But we have to be careful. I mean, Israel used to be driven or led by terrorists. And many of a prime minister used to be listed as terrorists by the British. At that time, the US was not so involved in that, and you didn't have those foreign terrorist lists and things like this as we have today. But in the 40s and the 50s, the leaders of Israel were also like al-Jalani, they were terrorists. Meaning that there is a point where we have to look at these problems for a little bit more distance. And again, I'm not supporting the way the government was toppled in Syria and all that. We have discussed that already. But now we have to be pragmatic. I mean, they are there. We have to address that. The same as Israel, we can do exactly the same and say, well, they were terrorists, so we should get rid of all that and so on. But the fact of the matter is that they are here, and they are accepted by the international community. So we have to move forward with that. The problem is that we should be consistent with that. I mean, when we say Hamas is terrorist, you see, there is a point we will have to talk to the Palestinians, that we will have to talk to people, whether they call Hamas or something else, they will be the same people. At the end of the day, we see that the name changed, but the people are still the same, and they have the same claims, and they have the same objectives, and they have, and for the Palestinians, it's obviously something which is even supported by UN resolutions. So they will stay there. So just putting a tag terrorist on people will not solve the question. We are just kicking the can down the road. There will be a point where we will have to talk to them. And there is a point where we will have to consider that if they were terrorists at one point, they may be considered as different as terrorists. This is something we have to look extremely pragmatically, because a lot of people, I mean, I had an uncle fighting in the French resistance during World War II. He was considered as a terrorist by the Germans. You see, he was a terrorist. I mean, of course, when he talked to me, explained his war, he didn't say I was a terrorist. He said he was a resistant. Meaning that the word terrorist, it's a little bit like the sanctions. And very often, by the way, the word terrorist is related to the application of sanctions. So we are still we are back to this problem of having, instead of having a solid foreign policy, we just tag people with some words, and that allows us to apply sanctions. But we are back to the problem I mentioned before, that we have no other means to solve problems. At the end of the day, why did the Swiss, for instance, consider that Hamas would be terrorists? I mean, Hamas has never been active in Switzerland, has never threatened Switzerland in any way. And the Israelis do exactly as the Germans did during the occupation of France. They are considering everybody that resists occupation as terrorists. That's exactly what's happening in Israel. But for other countries who are not involved in the conflict, who don't want to be involved, I mean, militarily in the conflict, what's the point designating an entity as terrorist? None. And that's where the problem starts. I can understand that the Germans considered my uncle as terrorist. I can understand that. I can understand that the Israelis may consider Hamas as terrorist. But the rest of the world should keep a cold head, so to say, and address the problem pragmatically, not to involve themselves into the conflict by putting tags on individuals, and start the work of diplomacy, negotiation, and talking to people. When you start saying this is a terrorist, that means I will not talk to you. There's a point where you will have to. You see, and that's exactly where I see a huge problem with our diplomacies in the West, because we are just keeping closing doors, while diplomacy should be about keeping doors open. Even in the worst crisis, even in the worst situation, diplomacy should be the last resort to address problem, even when you are at war. And that's very true for Ukraine. That's very true for others. I mean, to be honest, I cannot understand the relationship that you have between the United States and Cuba, Venezuela, or Iran, cutting every tie, trying to isolate those countries. If we want to change, if we consider that they don't have the right governance or things like that, okay, then talk to them. Let's try to improve situation with them. Isolating people is just kicking the can down the road. So we have a totally wrong approach with all these problems, especially with your enemy. This is, I think Confucius used to say that he said, send your enemies, your friends out of the or far from you, and keep your enemies close to you, because that's the only way to, if you consider them as enemies, the best way to control them is to have them close to you. Let your friends go far away and keep your enemies close to you. And I think that's something that we should apply on the diplomacy. The word enemy should be understood as subjective, of course, but if you, I don't see any reason for not talking to Iran, for instance. It's absurd. Especially if we consider that it is a threat. The best way to diffuse the threat is to open a dialogue. So this should be the first one. You don't need, why should the US need to talk to a friendly country? In fact, yes, of course, because they are friendly. you can expand on that. That's not a problem. But your first priority should be to open dialogue with your enemy. It's the best way to solve the problem. To be on the same line to some extent. If you consider that something might go wrong, probably the most useful channel you want to keep is a channel for negotiation, for dialogue. Again, I cannot understand the way our countries understand foreign policy. I have been myself military advisor to the foreign ministry in Switzerland, and I cannot understand today how people behave. I mean, this is totally a partisan approach to problems. This is definitely not in the Swiss tradition, and I would say it's not even in the tradition of diplomacy. But
Yeah. Colonel, just to wrap up this session, what's your take on what's going on between Yemen and the United States? We know that Yemenis are capable, they have hit some targets in Tel Aviv and Ben Gurion airbase, and on the other hand, we know that the situation in Lebanon is not that much better. They're trying to communicate, the government in Lebanon is trying to communicate with the West because they're trying to do something with the West, but it doesn't seem that the West appreciate appreciates what they're doing. And it seems that Israel has much leverage on the West, on the Trump administration. Do you think that we're going to getting back to the same situation that we've been before with the Biden administration? Yemen is attacking. We have the new front, and Hezbollah is just right now is evaluating, assessing what the government is capable of doing. If they're not capable of defending Lebanon, they're going to join the fight. They're not going to stay silent and just let Israel do whatever they want. How do you see that?
well, again, you have to go to the root causes of the problem, and the root causes of the conflict there is, in fact, the compliance of Israel with the international law. This is the key of the problem. And what we are back to the previous discussion, in fact, because what we see is the total absence of the West in trying to pressure Israel to comply with international law. And that's extremely disturbing, because what again, I'm personally adverse to these unilateral embargoes and things like this, both when it's done by the West as when it's done by the Houthis. But what the Houthis are doing, in fact, is to impose an embargo for Israel, towards Israel, by preventing shipping to go to Eilat, the port in the south of Israel. That's all. They don't. The Houthis are not shooting at any ship going through the Red Sea. They are targeting those who are heading towards Eilat, meaning that the idea of the Houthis was to force Israel to go into a ceasefire, to implement a ceasefire. So we are not to something which is totally exotic. They don't want to change the regime in Israel. They just want Israel to comply with international law. Would the West do the same from a diplomatic point of view, I'm afraid, through diplomatic channel, through dialogue and negotiation, then the Houthis would not need to do that. But they feel they are obliged to do that because nobody does what it was supposed to do. And that the Hezbollah was the same, by the way. So we have the same kind of discourse, because we like when I say we, I would the West, but I would probably more specifically the US. They're very keen to impose embargoes, blockades for Cuba, Venezuela, and others, and they are very keen to enforce them. And when others do the same, then it's something they don't like, and that's not the way the world should work. If everybody would apply the international law, the abide by UN resolutions, and all that, everything would be fine. And again, we are back to the same problem. We have only a few rogue countries who refuse to abide by UN resolutions, who question the legitimacy of those resolutions, and therefore don't want to apply those resolutions. And that's where that should be the focus of our of our foreign policies in the West. But we're not doing that. Therefore, we are pushing countries to act because obviously the situation of the Palestinians is outraging. It is. And but the outrage is in the West something that we read in some papers, but that stops there. There is no political action. There is no attempt to change things. There is no pressure on Israel. There is not even, I would say, a dialogue towards this. And therefore, we are, in fact, we are pushing others to act. We are pushing the Houthis to do what we should do to some extent. Probably not in the same form, but with the same purpose. That means forcing the Israelis to do what they were supposed to do as a country that accepted the rule of the international community and the international law, as Israel said, I mean, promised in 1949 as a condition to enter the United Nations. So again, we are always back to the same problem. International law is here to regulate relations between countries. If I mean, there are rules. If we don't agree with those rules, there's an International Court of Justice and such institutions to address the problems among countries. But when it comes to Israel, nobody wants to do that. And Israel, in fact, has an incredible power in the world because it can decide if the international. I don't even understand why Israel is in the UN, because it refused all the decision of the UN, and that to me is a contradiction that I don't understand how our modern world can accept that. The fact of the matter is that I always talk about the international law. And I also assume, because I was raised with this idea that there is an international law-based order. But notice that today, most countries, including Switzerland, by the way, has changed its narrative. It's no longer the international law-based order. It's the rule-based order. And that changed everything, because the rules, who decide about those rules? They are not law. They are rules. And they are decided mostly unilaterally or unilaterally by a group of countries or things like that. It's not the laws of everybody. These are rules decided by some countries. And that's where you start to you enter the problem. International law is something that was established in 1945 with the establishment of the United Nations. That was consolidated by the to some extent by the judgment of the Nuremberg trials that provided a lot of elements for the international law, especially when it comes to the international humanitarian law. But that's part of humanitarian law, by international law, and that's the result, that's the result of the lessons that we should have learned from World War II. The international law-based order should be the result of what we have learned in World War II. And that worked for a couple of for decades, but now it seems that we have forgotten that, and that's the rule of the strongest. And the strongest so far was the United States, so they established their own rules, meaning that we are now in a system that is based on rules decided by some countries. And that's exactly what cannot work. If we were a mature society, and when I say society, I mean the whole of the West and probably world society, we should realize that the best way to achieve peace is to abide by the international law. And if everybody would abide by this, then everything would be fine. You know, when we talk about, you mentioned, I'm back to the Ukrainian conflict. You say Russia invaded, but we have to understand, why did they invade? And they invaded because the Ukrainians didn't apply international law. That starts there. So whether the decision of the Russia was good or not, it's a matter of judgment, and it's a matter of debate. But the fact of the matter is that the reason why they intervened was because Ukraine breached international law. And that's this is the whole thing. You know, we tend to ignore a lot of aspects because we redefine the conflict as we want, and that's where, again, we are an international order based on rules and no longer on law, and that's what justifies our approach to problems, where we start to sanction everybody and all that, instead of talking. With in 2014, the Ukrainian government was toppled by the West, clearly, and that was recognized. I mean, I think it's no longer a discussion on that, but that's a reality. So why do we interfere with those countries? If there is a government, that, why don't we talk? But again, we are back. You know, it's a vicious circle, because we don't talk to countries and we prefer to change the governance. So instead of talking, instead of changing the governance,
Yeah.
we are back to the same problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure as always.
Thank you.